In 1969, a World Cup qualifying match between two small Central American countries ended with fighter jets bombing villages, soldiers crossing borders, and over 1,000 people dead in less than 5 days. The world nicknamed it the Football War. Everyone has heard the headline. Almost nobody knows the real story, because soccer didn't start this war. Soccer just lit the fuse on something that had been building for decades. This is not a story about soccer hooligans. It's a story about land, migration, and 250,000 people caught between two governments that had been building toward war for years. The football match didn't cause this war. It was simply the moment the world finally noticed. El Salvador was and still is one of the most densely populated countries in the Americas. Honduras, its neighbor, was the opposite, vast, fertile, and largely empty. For decades, hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans crossed the border to farm Honduran land. Honduras didn't just tolerate it. For years, it welcomed the labor and the productivity Salvadoran farmers brought with them. By the late 1960s, an estimated 300,000 Salvadorans were living and farming inside Honduran territory. Entire communities, generations of families who had built homes, raised children, and farmed land they considered theirs in every way that mattered, except, as it would soon turn out, legally. In 1962, the Honduran government passed sweeping land reform laws that prioritized native-born Honduran farmers over foreign settlers. On paper, it was domestic agricultural policy. In practice, it was the beginning of a mass expulsion. Salvadoran families who had farmed the same land for generations suddenly found themselves classified as illegal occupants of their own homes. Through the 1960s, tens of thousands of Salvadorans were forcibly removed from Honduran land, sometimes by legal eviction, sometimes by mob violence the Honduran government did little to stop. They fled back across the border into a country that was already overcrowded with no jobs and no land waiting for them. By 1969, this was not a sporting rivalry. This was a humanitarian crisis with two governments on the edge of war, and the world hadn't noticed yet. In June 1969, El Salvador and Honduras were drawn against each other in qualifying for the 2070 World Cup. Under any other circumstances, this would have just been a soccer match. But these two nations arrived at the first game already carrying years of resentment, displacement, and rage that had nowhere else to go. The stadium in San Salvador was packed, electric, and primed to explode. All three qualifying matches were marred by violence. Fans attacked, hotels stormed, players reportedly kept awake the night before games by hostile crowds outside their windows. Each match, hosted in the home team stadium, was won by the home team, and each result deepened the other nation's sense of humiliation and grievance. After Honduras's loss in the decisive match, Salvadoran media reported that a young Honduran woman watching the game on television took her own life in despair. Her funeral was broadcast nationally, attended by government officials, and used by Salvadoran press to paint Honduras as an enemy nation rather than a soccer rival. Whatever the full truth of that individual tragedy, it became a turning point, the moment two nations stopped seeing each other as neighbors. Within days, El Salvador severed diplomatic relations with Honduras entirely. Borders slammed shut. Trade between the two nations, bound together through the Central American Common Market, collapsed overnight. What had been a soccer rivalry just weeks earlier was now an active, undeclared international crisis. Tens of thousands of Salvadoran refugees, already displaced once by land reform, were now actively driven out of Honduras amid the rising hostility, flooding back into an already overcrowded El Salvador with nothing. The Salvadoran government, facing a refugee crisis it could not absorb and a public demanding action, began preparing for something far more serious than a soccer rematch. On July 14, 1969, just over 3 weeks after the final qualifying match, El Salvador launched a full military invasion of Honduras. This was not a riot. This was not a border skirmish. This was a sovereign nation ordering its army across an international border. Salvadoran aircraft struck Honduran targets within hours, including the country's main airport, in an attempt to cripple Honduran air capability before ground troops crossed the border. Within the first day, what the world had called a soccer war had become an actual shooting war, with bombs falling on a sovereign nation over a dispute that had nothing to do with the sport that gave it its name. Salvadoran ground forces pushed across the border on multiple fronts, advancing faster than Honduran defenses could organize a response. For a brief, brutal window, it looked as though El Salvador might achieve a decisive military victory in a matter of days. But Honduras fought back in the air, and the result became one of history's strange footnotes. The dogfights over Central America in July 1969 are remembered today as among the last combat engagements ever fought between propeller-driven fighter aircraft, a brief and accidental echo of an earlier era of warfare playing out in the skies above a conflict that started on paper with a soccer match. As always in war, it was civilians who paid the steepest price. Villages caught between advancing armies, homes destroyed, families displaced for the second or third time in a single year. International pressure arrived almost immediately. The Organization of American States convened an emergency session demanding an immediate ceasefire and threatening diplomatic and economic consequences if El Salvador did not withdraw. Facing the prospect of complete regional isolation, El Salvador agreed to a ceasefire just 100 hours after the invasion began. The shortest war in modern Latin American history had a name almost as fast as it had an ending. Salvadoran forces withdrew from Honduran territory under the terms of the ceasefire. No territory had changed hands, no clear military victor had emerged. All that remained was the wreckage and the unresolved grievances that caused the war in the first place, now made immeasurably worse. Estimates of the dead range from 600 to over 2,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them civilians. More than 100,000 people were left displaced, a war that the world remembers, if it remembers it at all, as a quirky footnote about soccer, left a death toll and a refugee crisis that was anything but a joke. A formal peace treaty between El Salvador and Honduras wasn't signed until 1980, 11 years after the fighting stopped. The Central American Common Market, the regional trade alliance both countries had depended on, never fully recovered. Today, the border is calm. Trade flows. Fans from both nations will watch this year's World Cup the way fans everywhere do, with passion, with noise, with flags painted on their faces. The game hasn't changed, but maybe after 1969, the world finally understands what's really sitting underneath all that passion when nations meet on a field. They call it the football war, but football didn't start it. Decades of land, displacement, and broken promises did. The soccer match was simply the spark that finally lit a fire that had been waiting to burn for years. The next time you watch two nations face off on a football pitch, remember Amelia Bolanos. Remember the families pushed off land they had farmed for generations. Remember that behind every flag in the stands, there is sometimes a history far heavier than the game being played. This is the football war. Now you know the real story.